We believe that the ESG inquiry is a multifaceted one, requiring practitioners from different disciplines working together in a multidisciplinary way to truly support our clients in understanding how environmental, social, and governance factors impact their businesses. In the next clip, you'll see our practitioners in different departments and across our offices in Africa talking about how they support and assist our clients on their ESG journeys.
The ESG megatrend has really shone a light on externalities and environmental issues that were not always traditionally considered in the investment analysis. This has changed as a result of greater awareness of things like planetary boundaries and the impacts exceeding these boundaries has on our economies and societies.
For me in forensics, ESG is all about governance. It's how companies put policies and programs together to ensure compliance with environmental standards and controls.
The social aspect of ESG allows me to drive positive ways for companies to interact with their employees as well as the communities in which they operate, thus foregrounding social equity for all.
Those in the petroleum, mining and manufacturing sectors look to us in assisting with compliance with environmental laws, obtaining relevant permits from the Environmental Protection Agency and compliance with their internal ESG framework.
My clients care about the message they convey on ESG. They seek my assistance to ensure that their publications are fully transparent and accurate.
I get called on by clients to assist them to navigate the implementation of ESG projects from a tax perspective. This would involve from the structuring of these projects up to claiming and making sure that they claim the right tax incentives.
At the heart of ESG is the hope that companies will be able to improve their performance by, for example, reducing the carbon footprint. I'm very keen on working with companies to consider the tax implications of their investments in energy-saving equipment as well as renewable energy technology in order to achieve that objective.
The shipping industry has set itself ambitious targets for ESG, in particular decarbonization. Our shipping clients turn to us to assist them to navigate through this rapidly changing regulatory environment.
As an energy and environmental lawyer, ESG plays a significant role in the work that I do on a daily basis. For the past year, I've had the great opportunity to advise on various green hydrogen projects, but also to attend green hydrogen conferences such as the World Hydrogen Congress in Rotterdam.
We are seeing an increased interest from clients as to whether they are under any regulatory obligation to take into account ESG type factors in the context of, for example, their investment decision-making processes.
We have focused on waste management for many years, and in particular at the moment we have been assisting clients with the extended producer responsibility regulations, which is part of circularity and certainly fits into ESG.
We have been receiving an increasing demand from clients requiring assistance with their agreements or structuring advice following the implementation of, for example, the MSDG scheme, which has been launched by the Central Electricity Board and other renewable energy schemes. This is one of the many aspects of ESG.
In recent times, we've seen the introduction of very wide-ranging global sanctions, and the consequences for contravening these sanctions can be incredibly significant. We've assisted our clients with navigating this complex space, and that often begins with good corporate governance.
ESG provides a great mechanic for funders to drive good social and environmental behaviour of borrowers and issuers through the use of green loans and sustainability-linked funding.
Everyone has his own role to play to achieve a more sustainable economy, and the world of finance is a key and critical driver of such transition.
The intersection between ESG and competition law, or antitrust, has historically not received a lot of attention. However, as ESG efforts increase and have more market impact, this is starting to change, especially in instances where firms collaborate to implement ESG principles across industries.
Climate litigation, or green litigation, has increased the globe over. This stands to impact both government and private companies alike.
I make sure that corporate South Africa is also playing its part in building a sustainable society that is kinder to the environment.
As a finance lawyer, I believe that ESG calls for more responsible financing and driving the change, assisting companies in complying with their ESG requirements.
Landscape finance is calling on us to look at finance in a different light. It's about valuing nature from a financial perspective, seeing nature as an asset, and finding the intersection where finance and nature meet.
Sustainable finance could make the world greener. Let's use it.
Hello, I'm Jessica Blumenthal, a director in the Banking and Finance Department of ENS Africa and a member of the ESG team. You would have heard my colleagues talking about the multifaceted nature of ESG, what it means to each of them in their different practice areas. and you might be wondering what ESG means for you in your organization. In the next video, my colleague James Brand will lay down some of the foundational principles necessary to truly integrate environmental, social, and governance factors into your day-to-day decision-making. This is very much a high-level or introductory session designed to start your thinking about ESG. You may well have further questions or require more detailed information after having watched this video, but at least this video will empower you with the underlying principles necessary to engage with this topic further.
Hi, I'm James Brand from ENS Africa, and I am an environmental lawyer in the Natural Resources and Environmental Department. Today, I'll be providing an ESG 101 or overview on ESG, and we'll look to briefly unpack where it came from, what it means, what it seeks to achieve, and what key regulatory developments we can anticipate. A good place to start when trying to understand what ESG is all about is to look back to where it came from and what its primary aim or focus originally was. In this regard, the acronym ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, was first coined in 2004 by Paul Clements Hunt in the work he led with his team at the UN Finance Initiative, or UNEP, under the late Kofi Annan. ESG began as a sustainable finance term as part of the investment analysis inquiry to shine a light on unforeseen risks and externalities that were not being considered or priced into the investment analysis. ESG was primarily about understanding risk based on an assessment by an investor of potential impacts on the enterprise value of investees they were looking to invest in. This is known as the outside-in perspective, as you look at outside factors like climate change or human rights abuses in the supply chain to assess the risks this would have inside an organization and how this could affect your value or profits. Things like the transition away from fossil fuels, for example, could have a material impact on the risk weighting an investor places on an entity they're looking to fund or invest in. This is also known as single materiality and would be considered material if it would assist users in predicting an entity's future cash flows over the short, medium, and long term. Due to the historic misconception that ESG factors are not financially material, some investors have used the concept of fiduciary duty as a reason not to incorporate ESG issues. To answer the question whether investors were required to consider ESG risk in the investment analysis, UNEP commissioned the law firm Freshfields to consider this. And in 2005, Freshfields published a report titled A Legal Framework for the Integration of ESG Issues into Institutional Investment. This report was led by Professor Paul Watchman and concluded that integrating ESG considerations into an investment analysis so as to more reliably predict financial performance is clearly permissible and is arguably required in all jurisdictions. Recognizing the risks arising from a failure to consider ESG factors, multiple jurisdictions throughout the world have sought to regulate the position with an increasing number of policy interventions as depicted in the slide from the PRI. Increasingly, asset owners and investors are being required to consider ESG in their investment analysis, as regulators globally recognize the systemic risks to the financial system that failing to consider material ESG risks may give rise to. In South Africa, July 2011, amendments to our regulations under the Pension Funds Act came into effect and included a new requirement in Regulation 28 for pension funds to consider ESG issues in assessing factors that materially affect long-term performance of retirement fund assets. Since then, National Treasury has published a policy paper titled Financing a Sustainable Economy in October last year, and this document indicates an intention on the part of National Treasury to expand the relevance of ESG beyond just our pension funds to other sectors, including banks, collective investment schemes, private equity players, capital markets, and the insurance sector. So what we've been speaking about up until now is ESG in its original and traditional sense as a risk item. It makes sense to want to enhance an understanding of risks. So this aspect of ESG is more widely accepted. What is less widely accepted historically is the use of ESG as a means to understand and address impact. In this regard, ESG is being used in a second way, in addition to ESG as a risk item, and that is considering ESG in terms of impact. The second way of viewing ESG is more controversial and is not universally accepted and arises from the question as to whether companies have an obligation to act in the best interests of society, the economy, and the environment to assist in addressing the types of social and environmental issues we see in the slide. And here we're not talking about corporate social investment or CSI initiatives that are external to the operation of the business. We're talking about the operations and business itself and how this gives rise to impacts beyond the four walls of the business. There's long been a debate as to whether it's appropriate for corporations to be concerned with whether their operations negatively impact our society, economy, and the environment. Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago didn't think so, and in 1970 put forward the economic theory of shareholder primacy, which provided that management's only duty was to maximize shareholder value. This cartoon in the middle of the slide is taken from a book called Reimagining Capitalism by Harvard professor Rebecca Henderson, and captures the crossroads we're at, as rightly or wrongly, we're beginning to see a shift away from this traditional economic model premised solely on shareholder value. ESG is being used in a second way as a means to broaden the inquiry beyond just shareholder value, in recognition that companies have a role to play in acting in the best interests of our economies, society, and the environment. In this regard, ESG is being viewed from an inside-out perspective to understand the impacts an entity has on stakeholders outside of the organization more broadly. And this economic theory is sometimes referred to as stakeholder primacy. This dual approach to considering ESG both outside in terms of risk to enterprise value and profits, and inside out in terms of impacts outside of the organization is sometimes referred to as double materiality. And the early indications are that this is the approach to ESG that will be adopted in the EU as well as here in South Africa. So if ESG was coined in 2004 and laws requiring ESG to be considered in certain instances in South Africa, for example, were passed in 2011, why the noticeable uptick in ESG more recently? Businesses today are operating in fast-moving times, and the drive towards operating sustainably is in the headlines and is everywhere you look. It's not entirely clear why there has been this uptick, and commentators are asking, why now? What needed to be put in place for this to happen? Perhaps we needed to have the experience of the 2007-2008 financial crisis to understand what unforeseen or unpriced risks can do to our financial systems. And perhaps we needed to experience a global pandemic to provide a collective reflection on what forces of nature can do to our economies and societies. The elevation of ESG is also partly driven by stakeholders beyond the shareholder group that are demanding change, particularly in the younger generations, but it's also driven by reputation-related considerations. There's more and more data coming through indicating that those companies that have embedded ESG criteria into their operations outperform their peers by having a better handle on risk. So there's an economic driver as well. There's also legal and regulatory standards suggesting a failure to fully understand ESG risk is inconsistent with fiduciary duties. At present, over 5,000 institutional investors, including many South African financial institutions, have signed up to the UN's Principles of Responsible Investment, or the PRI. This translates to over $120 trillion that is available for ESG investment. This is a significant business opportunity. ESG considerations are relevant to investors looking to allocate funding to ESG-aligned assets, but it's also relevant to investors looking to attract sustainable finance. If an enterprise or activity is ESG-aligned, it will enhance its ability to attract ESG-related finance. This has given rise to greenwashing risk, with significant portions of the global economy jumping on board with claims of sustainability. There are many greenwashing scandals surfacing in the press, from accusations relating to blatantly providing false and misleading claims by Volkswagen in respect of their emission tests, to HSBC being ordered to take down their climate change advertising, arising from a failure to fully disclose the significant funding they were still making towards the fossil fuel sector, to Deutsche Bank's asset management unit being raided as part of a legal investigation in Germany to determine whether they had lied about taking ESG factors into account in their investment products. The law is evolving in the space, and we're seeing a move from soft law to hard law obligations to assist in stamping out greenwashing and the prevalence of the types of examples I've just mentioned, particularly with the emergence of taxonomies, which I'll unpack briefly a bit later. So what are the relevant considerations that go into the ESG inquiry? The three factors of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, are broad-ranging, and each of the considerations listed in the slide can be unpacked into their own granular detail. From a business perspective, the key, however, is to identify which of these multiple factors are material to your business, both in terms of risk, but also in terms of impact, as well as identifying the opportunities. There are tools out there to get you started on this journey, which can then be tested and verified with management, and ultimately unpacked into the granular detail required to fully understand the risks and opportunities with the assistance of technical and other outside consultants and advisors. For material ESG risk that has not been managed by a company, there are two types of risk. Firstly, unmanageable risk that cannot be addressed by company initiatives. This would include systemic risks that are simply beyond the control of the operations and cannot always be foreseen. such as the 2007-2008 financial crash, for example. And then secondly, what is known as the management gap, which represents risks that could be managed by a company through suitable initiatives, but which may not yet be managed. It's this management gap of risks that could be the focus of any policy or strategy on ESG. But it's also relevant to understand what overarching ESG regulatory developments are in the pipeline at a framework level that may impact on the business. The question is, what laws can we anticipate in the ESG space that should be anticipated so as not to be caught flat-footed in the future? I'll briefly take you through 3 key ESG developments that we can anticipate to see as we see a gradual shift from soft law to hard law requirements on ESG disclosures, ESG supply chain due diligence, and ESG taxonomies. The first regulatory development we can anticipate relates to ESG disclosures. When it comes to disclosures, the free market operates on the basis that the market is perfectly efficient, but this is based on the assumption that market prices reflect all available relevant information. It's recognized that many externalities are not currently priced into the market, and relevant information on this is not disclosed, is not available. For example, water use metrics, a key risk item in water scarce areas, or carbon emission data to allow investors to model different scenarios based on different future carbon prices. It's the scope and quality of information that this first regulatory building block seeks to focus in on, to allow investors to compare apples with apples in a consistent manner to get a better handle on risk. The EU has led the way with disclosure regulation, and in South Africa, we have seen our recently published JSE disclosure guideline, which sets out the expected metrics that entities should be disclosing against. There's a lot of detail that is required to be disclosed against, and each color here represents the E, the S, and the G metrics that are recommended to be disclosed against in South Africa. Disclosing against these metrics is a massive task for General Counsel and Chief Sustainability Officers, particularly those that are not already thinking about how they're going to build out the systems required to gather all of this data so as to make the expected disclosures. One of the major criticisms of the disclosure requirement space is the draining of human and financial capacity experienced by companies as different investors demand different disclosure regimes, giving rise to a duplication of disclosure and reporting requirements. Sustainability reporting is a crowded space as there are multiple different reporting frameworks and standards, each with their own acronym, giving rise to what you may have heard being referred to as the disclosure alphabet soup. Some of these frameworks include the SDGs, or the PRI, CDP, GRI, SASB, or the TCFD. In the same way that financial accounting standards converged and sought to achieve global harmonization through IFRS and GARP, we're starting to see the equivalent for sustainability reporting. Last year, we saw IFRS announce the creation of a new standard-setting board for sustainability reporting, the ISSB, and workers commenced to provide a harmonized global reporting standard for sustainability to allow for greater efficiency to collapse and harmonize these various disclosure regimes. In South Africa, as I mentioned, the JSE disclosure guideline seeks to distill the essence of these various regimes into a single document. But ultimately, the metrics that a company adopts to disclose against will inevitably reflect what their investors are demanding until we have a harmonized global standard. The second regulatory building block to unpack a bit further relates to ESG supply chain due diligence. Most companies' ESG-related impacts come from supply chains, and we see this in the press all the time. For example, recently Foxconn, the supply of microchips and components to Toyota and Apple, had to suspend plant operations in Southwest China a couple of months ago as the region experienced unprecedented droughts and heat waves, giving rise to volatility for Toyota and Apple. So you really start to see these linkages, and we can anticipate greater regulation to enhance scrutiny up and down supply chains, as most supply chain managers don't have visibility into these types of risks. In February this year, the European Commission adopted a proposal allowing the EU to indirectly regulate the affairs of non-EU companies that do business in the EU up to a specified threshold. This cross-border theme is seen in other instruments like CBAM, which is the cross-border adjustment mechanism that is being proposed in the EU, which seeks to tax goods entering the EU that are produced using fossil fuels. Last month, the South African Reserve Bank released a report on the risks these types of adjustments being proposed by our trading partners pose to our economy. So over time, we will need to keep an eye on these types of developments as greater scrutiny can be expected up and down supply chains. The third regulatory development to unpack a bit further relates to ESG taxonomies. This body of regulation seeks to set technical and legal criteria that products, projects, and companies need to meet in order to be considered ESG aligned, to avoid greenwashing or false claims of being ESG compliant. South Africa, 2 rounds of our taxonomy have been subject to public comment, and the finalized version was published early in the year. South Africa's taxonomy is similar to that of the EU and covers multiple sectors as demonstrated in the slide that is lifted from the taxonomy, with specific requirements being set out for each sector for what would be considered sustainable best practice. The first step of the inquiry into ESG alignment is part of a technical assessment to determine whether water consumption or air emission thresholds are met, for example. The second step of the inquiry is known as the Do No Significant Harm inquiry, which seeks to avoid a scenario where you may have a green hydrogen facility that ticks all the climate change boxes, but fails on other aspects of the inquiry. For example, that green hydrogen facility may have a wind energy component that is cited in the migratory flight path of endangered bird species, giving rise to biodiversity impacts that are not capable of mitigation. The third step of the inquiry is what is known as the minimum social safeguards inquiry and seeks to determine if local labor laws and standards are met, as well as international best practice when it comes to human rights. For example, that green hydrogen facility example that I mentioned earlier may be sourcing its component parts from areas of the world with questionable human rights records, for example, or they may be in non-compliance with their local labor laws. As taxonomies become more widely adopted, a failure by projects to demonstrate taxonomy alignment is likely to impact on the range or pricing of potential funding. From an investor point of view, the taxonomy allows investors to use the taxonomy to evaluate risks in their own portfolio and to compile disclosures in terms of their own underlying exposure. From an investee point of view, the taxonomy allows investees to compile disclosures against the taxonomy that can then assist them in attracting favorable finance on the basis of being taxonomically aligned.
Thank you, James. I think what's clear is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the ESG inquiry. Each individual, each organization, each country needs to consider the environmental, social, and governance factors pertaining to it, and these will differ, particularly sector by sector. But only once these factors have been truly understood can they be integrated into strategy and decision-making. And only once they're integrated into decision-making can they assist an organization to better manage its risks, better identify opportunities, and ensure business sustainability into the ever-changing future. I hope that the principles that James has described have been helpful in laying down a foundation for your further exploration of this topic. As I mentioned, you probably have very many more questions, and certainly ESG is a rapidly growing area with a lot of regulatory change and industry development on a daily basis. It takes quite a bit to stay on top of all of it. At the time of recording this video, world leaders are meeting at COP27 to look for ways to better collaborate on a global scale to ensure sustainability for our planet. ESG offers each of us the opportunity to be part of that change and to do what we can in our own context to ensure real-world impact. We hope that this has been helpful. Thanks very much for your attention. Goodbye.